All right, so yeah, this is Hebrews chapter 4. We're going to look at tonight, just a couple of verses. Hebrews 4, verse 1. Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest anyone or any of you seem to have come short of it. So, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, and we're going to talk about what that is in a second, let us fear, he talks about this is worth fearing, lest any of you seem to have come short of it. All right, so he's talking about the rest, God's rest, and entering God's rest, his rest. And this is mentioned a number of times in the book of Hebrews. And I just want to give you guys some background on how this is used and what it means in the book of Hebrews, this God's rest thing. And it's very important. It's talking about something very big. And you got to think about it foundationally, and remember that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and then rested on the seventh. That's how the book of Genesis portrays it. God works; He creates the earth, heavens and the earth, and everything in them and on them in 6 days, and then He rested on the seventh day. Now, each day of that 7 day week represents an act of God's creation. And days 1 through 6, each day is designated, attached to, representing different acts of God's creation as you read through there. So, days 1 through 6, God worked, He created, He was working. And then day 7, He rested. So God worked for 6 days, and however different people interpret the length of the days, 1 through 6, but I'm staying big picture here, and I just want you to see that the pattern, because it is a day is assigned to all the different creative acts of God. One 24-hour period is a sign, and it might just be an icon of a bigger period of time, or it might be 24 hours. Throughout church history, church fathers were divided on that. Some church fathers said, yeah, that was 24-hour period, 6 days. And then others say, no, wasn't super long, but it was longer than 24 hours. But I'm not going to get into that. I just want us to see the patterns here of what's presented in the book of Genesis, that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and then rested on the seventh. Each day of the 7 day week represents an act of God's creation as you read Genesis. And you see that days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, He is working. And then on day 7, He rested. So there you have the 7 day week structure presented right out of the gate in the book of Genesis. And this is what this rest is referring to, the seventh day rest. After God worked, He rested. And I'll talk about what that represents here in a second. All right, so ancient Israel's 7 day week. So they followed that pattern of creation, of God's creation week. That was their existence. The Mosaic law required Israelites to work 6 days a week, and it was to be good and God honoring work. Whatever you're doing it for the glory of God. The Israelites were to cease from their work on the seventh day, the Sabbath day. So they were to work 6 days, good God honoring work, and then they were to cease from their work on the seventh day. And so the Sabbath rest, and as you read the Old Testament, because a lot of people think of the Sabbath, because it's kind of not represented well today in modern Judaism. The Sabbath day, it's a little crazy sometimes. But in the Bible, it was to be a time of very joyous fellowship with God and the people of God. I mean, you are worshiping God and you are with God and you're with the people of God and you're with your family on that day. And it was to be filled with joy. The Sabbath was created for man. Man was not created for the Sabbath. Jesus said that. And so it's something to bless the human race, this Sabbath day. So Israel's week was a repeating image of the week of creation, 6 days working and a seventh day rest. And so it was just constantly repeating what God did. Work for 6 days, rest on the seventh. Work for 6 days, rest on the seventh. So your whole life you're doing that. And you're kind of an image, you have a small image of the week of creation that you're going through on a repeated basis. And that was important because that was to be an ongoing reminder of reality. Because as you go through the week, you're to actually be thinking about the fact that this 7-day week that we're going through was sourced in God's creative week, the week where He created everything. And so this would be a reminder of reality to you. And you were to think of these things, that it is God who brought all things into existence, including humans. So as you're going through the week, you're thinking God created the heavens and the earth, and He created the human race. He created all of these things. And God created us, and He sustains us. And therefore, He must have our loyalty. So each week, as you went through it, you were to remember we're just going through the pattern of what God did in the beginning when He created the heavens and the earth. He brought all things into existence. He is our creator. Therefore, we should worship Him. And as you read the Old Testament, you read the Psalms, a lot of the praising of God is based on the fact that God created us. And it's just once you realize and once you understand, and when you believe that God brought you into existence, then it's a pretty simple step to say, well, then I owe Him my loyalty. I'm only here because He created me, and I only continue because He sustains me. And therefore, I must worship Him, this one who's brought me into existence and keeps me in existence. And you see in the book of Acts, this is St. Paul, and he's in Athens, and he's preaching, and he says, he's talking about the Creator. He gives to all life, breath, and all things. And then a little bit later, he says, for in Him we live and move and have our being. That's what the 7-day week is all about. It's like liturgical. Going through the week, today is Wednesday, right? Going through Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday for a Jew, what they worked on those days, and they were to remember that God created things on those days. God worked on those days. And then on the seventh day, our Saturday, that's the day when God rested. So that's when the Jews rested. And they did that each week. And it was really important. God wanted them to remember that as they went through the week. That's why He's very strong in the law about breaking the Sabbath, because there was the death penalty required for somebody who broke the Sabbath. And so it's pretty extreme because He's just emphasizing it. He wants us to remember this week, 6 days, and then the seventh is all an image of the creation week. And you do what I did. In that week, I worked for 6, and on the seventh, I rested. And you are to follow that pattern as my covenant people. And so that they were to remember that, not just say, oh, it's another day, but say, oh yeah, this is day 3 of creation, and day 4, day 5, and that's to be significant to them. So God's rest, the seventh day in the book of Hebrews, because St. Paul uses this to do some teaching. The 7-day week is also a microcosm of the lives of the faithful. This is really interesting, and this is how the book of Hebrews is using it. That the 7-day week is a microcosm of the lives of the faithful. The 6 days represent our lives on this earth. And here, as we're on this earth, we work. We work. And it's spiritual works. It's obedience to God. It's doing whatever we must to be faithful to God. It's the struggle, fighting temptation, on an ongoing basis. And you have those all the time that you have to struggle with, and struggling with your flesh and fighting it and putting it to death, like St. Paul says, and overcoming it. That's roll up your sleeves work. So the 6 days represent our lives on this earth, and we work. Obedience, faithfulness, struggle, discipline, all that stuff what comes with staying loyal to God, doing what you have to do, rolling up your sleeves and staying faithful to God, because that takes work. Discipline is work. The struggle against sin and the struggle against the devil and the struggle against this world, that takes work. If you're passive, you're just going to get sucked up in it. You got to be offensive. You got to be aggressive with it. And then the seventh day represent our lives in heaven, which is the new earth, the kingdom of Christ. So after a life of faithful works, our 6 days, our life here on this earth, then we rest with God, and that's the seventh day. That's the seventh day. This rest is filled with joyous fellowship with God and his people. And his people are the seed of Abraham, as we saw last week. And that's important. And that's why it's good to know what the Old Testament says about the Sabbath day, what's to take place in the Sabbath day. It's all about God, it's all about your family, it's all about the people of God. And it's to be joyous. And so that tells us that the seventh day in the Old Testament, if it's supposed to have that kind of an environment, then that is picturing to us that that is going to be the environment of the ultimate seventh day, which is the eternal state, which is heaven, which is the new earth, the kingdom of Christ. So right now, we're all going through the 6 days because we're still here. And so we have to work now, rest later. That's what we're working now. We know we're going to rest later, and you got to really get after it. It's kind of like how do you work before you go on vacation? Some of you are retired and like, my life's a vacation. It doesn't feel like one, but um, how do you work? I know what I do. It's like, oh, I'm going out of town for a week, or 2 weeks or whatever. And before that, it's amazing what I get done. The energy I have, boom, 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 because I've got to get this stuff done. And we kind of need to have that attitude as we're here in this life, that we're just getting after it and we're serious about it. And we're working like crazy to stay faithful to God, to be loyal to him, to love him, to worship him, to be focused on him, to overcome sin, the devil, the world, all that stuff. We're working at it. We're getting up and getting after it because we know the seventh day will come eventually and we can rest then. We can rest then. And this whole chapter deals with this, and I'm only going to touch the surface of it tonight and continue the rest of it next week. But I think that's just fascinating. In Hebrews 4:10, which we'll see next week, for those who enter God's rest also rest from their labors as God did from his. And so in the book of Hebrews, they're using the picture of the seventh day rest as the eternal state, being with God, being in heaven, the kingdom of God, the eternal kingdom of God. All right. So those who reject, and this is the flip side of what I was just talking about, those who reject the Creator in this life, during the 6 days, during this life, they reject the Creator. They don't believe in him, they don't care for him, they're not seeking him. Then the book of Hebrews says that they will not enter his rest. They will not enter into the seventh day rest with God. And he uses example after example in the book of Hebrews to talk about that. And then those who may have been walking with God and being part of the church, but then turn from it and leave it, like some of the people were doing in Judea, they will not enter God's rest too, St. Paul says. This is all very serious stuff. St. Paul says this in Hebrews 3:6, and we looked at this last week. Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. So we are part of God's house if we have faith and we stay faithful to the end. Hold it firm to the end. And if you do that, you enter God's rest. And then Jesus said in the book of Revelation, to him who overcomes, and overcoming takes work. I mean, this is something that you're doing. You're overcoming. You're staying loyal to God. You're fighting. You're struggling, with sin. You're overcoming temptation. You're doing that stuff. And when you fail at it, you ask for forgiveness, confession, and you get back to it. So to him who overcomes, I will give to eat from the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. So we got to hold firm to the end. We have to overcome if we want to enter God's rest. And he's going to use the example here in a second of the Israelites in the wilderness to kind of illustrate this. Hebrews 4:1 again, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. And like I said, he's going to use the example of Hebrews in the wilderness not getting into the promised land. They came short. They didn't enter into God's rest. All right, so what St. Paul is saying to the Hebrew Christians in Judea is this: Christ has promised that those who remain loyal to him will reside in his kingdom. You remain loyal to him, you will reside in his kingdom. And that message is very strong through the entire New Testament. We have to continue to be faithful to him, Do not turn from him. This is what he's saying to the Hebrew Christians. And earlier we saw in Hebrews chapter 2, where St. Paul says, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? And in that context, he's talking about the place, where the road leads to, not a very good place for those who neglect the salvation that's being offered by God. How are you going to escape that end, that terrible end of not entering into God's rest if you neglect so great a salvation? There's one way to get into the rest of God, right? Into God's rest, and that is through Christ and through faithfulness to Christ and receiving the benefits of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. That's the only way into God's rest. And so how are you going to escape going to the place of everlasting separation from God? How are you going to escape going there if you're neglecting this salvation? So he's really coming down strong on all of this stuff.